Welcome to Close Listening. I'm Zach Morgenstern, joined as always by silent co-host Ludwig von B. The Who are coming to Toronto, or at least the two surviving members of The Who, and I figured I should go to it because I like quite a few Who songs. My Generation, I Can See for Miles and Miles, The Kids Are All Right, I'm a Boy, Pinball Wizard, and they're absolute legends. When one thinks of the iconic all-time bands, one of course thinks of the Beatles and the Beach Boys and the Stones and Queen, and then The Who has to be right up there next. I don't know how historically accurate this is, but I also think of them as the band that developed or popularized the trope of destroying instruments on stage. At the same time, I can't say I know The Who's discography too deeply. My main experience with them being through the greatest hits album, Meaty, Beady, Big, and Bouncy. So I recently decided to take out a whole bunch of Who albums from the library, and I'm going to talk in this video about the first three of them. The Who sings My Generation. I believe this is the American version of the record, though it's very similar to the British. A Quick One, and in this case, I believe we had the British version rather than the American. I believe the American one is called Happy Jack and has the Happy Jack single on it. And then the sort of breakthrough third album, The Who Sell Out. Let's first start by talking about The Who sing My Generation. I thought this one had a nice collection of sounds on it. Track 3, The Good's Gone, has a nice kind of thump to it, even if the lyrics themselves are a bit simple. Then we get La 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 Lies, which has a nice, sweet 60s pop sound to it. There are a couple of James Brown covers on here, and with the one called Please, 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 I thought Roger Daltrey did a good job of paying tribute to James Brown's voice. The concluding track on this one here is one called Instant Parties, brackets, Circles. And this is a kind of mysterious psychedelic track with some cacophonous horns on it. Now, apparently, and this is something I learned through this process, John Entwistle, the bass player, played French horn. But because this is not, a professional orchestral arrangement, I don't know how John Entwistle ranked as a brass player, but it sounds more quirky than, your standard pop backing brass. This album has a bit of a running theme to it, and that there are a couple songs that seem to suggest a sort of defense of rock and roll, a defense of these figures in the limelight. Of course, the most famous and quite possibly the best sounding song on here is My Generation. It's a simple message. The old people are putting us down. They say we're having too much fun. It has this hiccupy thing where Roger Daltrey is barely held back from swearing. It's an absolutely iconic song if you haven't heard it. Then there's another great Who song, which is beautiful without being so directly edgy, and it's called The Kids Are All Right. And it opens with the line, I don't mind other guys dancing with my girl. So whereas My Generation is sort of putting down the sort of older judgmental generation, this one is celebrating the generation from within. Perhaps the ideas of free love, letting go of old conceptions of jealousy. And then finally, there's a song on here which is pretty wacky if you haven't heard it before, even though it's a simple rocker, and it's called It's Not True. And it seems to be The Who rejecting all kinds of rumors. And unfortunately, from quick internet research, I couldn't really find out where that's from. The one song on here I found a little weird is called Legal Matter, which seems to be singing about a divorce. Pete Townsend, rather than Roger Daltrey, sings that one, and his voice is a bit higher pitched and a bit whinier. So that song certainly has personality, though it's a bit harder, I think, to fall in love with than My Generation or The Kids Are All Right. So the next album The Who came out with was A Quick One. And as I was saying earlier, I think of The Who as part of like a big three of the British invasion bands with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. But because The Who came around just a few years later, it feels like they had to follow a trajectory. The Beatles had time to put out their pop albums, the Stones had time to put out their blues covers album, but pretty much, once The Who was together and putting out albums, it seems like there was already this expectation that rock be more than just popular music for the young people. It had to be making a statement. So with A Quick One, you get this cool cover art where the words are suggesting different songs. And this is also the one where Pete Townsend writes his first rock opera. It's not a full-fledged, full performance rock opera like we'd get later with Tommy, but it does end with a 9-ish minute selection, which is the title for this album, A Quick One. Before that, we get a bunch of quirky songs. The Pete Townsend opener of Run, Run, Run seems to be about superstition. And then we get a composition from John Entwistle, who seems to be quite the fun guy. We already learned that in addition to playing bass, he plays the French horn. Whereas here on this album, he gives us a song about a spider. Unfortunately, the spider gets squished at the end, but otherwise, I think it's a fun song for spider lovers because you get to hear a lot of Entwistle's bass and this silly, creepy voice. We also get a song on here called I Need You with Keith Moon singing some falsetto on it. Keith Moon, the drummer, for those who don't know, and it kind of sounds like a zombie song. And that's followed by another John Entwistle composition, which is called The Whiskey Man. So it feels like John Entwistle was maybe the Ringo Starr of The Who. He gave us kind of the fun, quirky songs. So part of the reason we're seeing a couple John Entwistle compositions on here, though I have the sense that maybe he genuinely enjoyed songwriting, as well as a Keith Moon composition, and we end up getting a Roger Daltrey composition as well called See My Way, is that apparently some deals were negotiated so that it was like better financially for all the band members to collect songwriting royalties. So even though Pete Townsend was the one who songwriting came most naturally to, they all made at least one contribution to this record. So that's something else that stands out about it. So yeah, we get Daltrey's song See My Way, which manages to bring John Entwistle's horns back into things. We also then get a song called So Sad, which has a bit of a bird sound to it. So far with this record, I kind of feel like the problem with The Who is their songs kind of sound like the Byrds, but just kind of thinner, because I guess the Byrds have those jangly 12-string guitars, and as far as I know, The Who did not. As I said, this album has a rock opera on it. It's called A Quick One While He's Away, and it seems to be a story of a couple either breaking up or just being separated, and the woman getting quite sad and being with this guy who's presented as weird and in some interpretations possibly predatory, Ivan, the old engine driver. I don't know if I love the song, but one thing I have to credit Pete Townsend with is it flows musically very well. It's a long piece with different melodies, but it all comes together nicely. So finally, we get this concept album, The Who Sell Out. We have pictures on the front and the back of the different band members promoting different products. And throughout this album, we hear various radio jingles. The opener to this album is quite something. It's called Armenia or Armenia, City in the Sky. It's a song with the catchiness of a pop tune, but kind of the glitter of psychedelia. So many psychedelic songs are cool to listen to, but too weird to really feel like songs. This one manages to both be pop and psychedelia in one. It's also interestingly not written by Pete Townsend or any of the members of The Who. It was by one of Pete Townsend's friends. We then get to a song called Marianne with Her Shaky Hands, which feels like a mix between being a nostalgia to sort of old 1950s housewifey kind of expectations with a kind of Beach Boy sound and a more implied irreverence in the subject matter. Tracks 4 and 5 blur the lines between the advertising and musical elements that we've seen on this album. We get this song, which sounds like a normal pop song, but then it turns out to be an ad for deodorant. And then track 5, it's a song about tattoos, and it kind of has the silliness of the deodorant song, but it's kind of serious at the same time. And I guess that's sort of how tattoos are in the real world. On the one hand, they're just drawings on people's arms. On the other hand, until very recently, they counted as scandalous and topics for controversy. First side of this, if you were listening to it as a vinyl record, ends with I Can See for Miles. And it's just miles better than so many of the songs one would have heard from The Who at this point. It's just the sound is so thick. There's some great vocal harmonies in there. I appreciated listening to it in the context of this advertising themed album as opposed to on the Greatest Hits collection where I heard it before, because there's this verse that goes, here's a poke at you, you're going to choke on it too, you're going to lose that smile because all the while. So what I got out of that verse in the context of this album is you can tell that Pete Townsend is playing the long game. Earlier in their career, The Who did have to do some ads, and this was increasingly something that was asked of popular musicians in the 1960s. And even though The Who had to do it, and apparently Keith Moon had a particularly fun time participating in ads, Pete Townsend felt really disgusted by the idea. So it feels like what he's doing with this album when he's saying, here's the poke at you, the advertising industry, is, well, you stole our music and turned it into ads. Now we're going to steal your ads and make them into music. So rather than just being enticed to buy a product, people are just going to appreciate the melodic element of advertising. I'd mentioned earlier when Pete Townshend's voice is a bit high and can sound kind of whiny in a way that's not great on the tracks that he sings. But on this album, I felt he channeled more of a Brian Wilson Beach Boys kind of vibe. We get that, for instance, on the song I Can't Reach You. Not letting the concept of the album go, the track listing brilliantly juxtaposes I Can't Reach You, a very heartfelt song, with a song called Medak, which, if you don't know the product, seems to be some sort of pimple cream. I guess it's as if the record is saying that everything in the modern world, things we want to be beautiful and heartfelt, they always end up being interrupted by ads. Track number 11 on the record is a tune by John Entwistle, where the chorus goes, "There goes Mingy Stingy." It's like he's singing about a Scrooge figure. So once again, John Entwistle comes in with kind of the quirky song. Again, he's kind of the Ringo of The Who, except unlike Ringo, who I felt like wrote rather sporadically, it feels like this came more naturally to John Entwistle. He probably had a mind full of eccentric songs. As with a quick one, The Who Sell Out ends with a rock opera, and I had similar feelings to it. Sounds fine, not that catchy. Unfortunately, while I feel like generally with its critique of advertising, this is a nice album for left-wing listeners, the subject of the last song, the idea of China invading Israel, doesn't sit so well with me politically. It seems like it's fear-mongering about the Reds, and also, buying into this idea that Israel is this isolated entity in the world. And while I can understand why someone in the 1960s like Pete Townshend would think that, especially I imagine in Britain, where Jews probably feel like more of a minority than they even do in America. He felt like he was, empathizing with that marginalized group. Obviously, we look at the situation today and we see Israel, a major ally of the United States, leaving Palestinians in abject poverty. And so it just makes it very hard for me to appreciate a song like Rael. But otherwise, this was a very cool record, a nice mix of things that sounded very good, like Armonia, as well as the brilliant satire of songs like Odorono, Tattoo, and Medak. So overall, mixed experience listening to these records. One of my goals was to fall in love with a lot of songs other than the greatest hits, because I've multiple times had the experience where I go to a concert and I think I know a musician very well, because I know a lot of their greatest hits. I had this experience with Elvis Costello, and weirdly enough, more recently with Weird Al, where it felt like knowing even a middling amount of their music wasn't good enough to enjoy a concert, because those artists clearly have a lot of favorite songs. This Weird Al concert I was at, he intentionally didn't play his parodies. He played his original songs, and I knew some of them, but I also didn't know a lot. I guess the point is, in advance of going to this Who concert, I want to know more Who songs than just the greatest hits. And I suppose, a few were added to my vocabulary. I can appreciate Harmonia now. I can appreciate It's Not True. I can appreciate Tattoo. But I feel like overall, a lot of these songs do suffer from the problem of the production feeling slightly thin. Like they had the instruments to make rock songs, but Pete Townshend wanted to be more of a rock visionary like David Bowie. And I feel like to be Bowie, you need a big musical sound to back you. So instead of just, making the most of their rock instruments and writing poppy songs like the early Beatles with a nice punch, the Who's music is kind of subdued and relied on Townshend's lyrics, despite not being the best format for putting those lyrics forward. I also wonder from a production history standpoint whether the Who had like good access to quality production in their early years. In one of the songs on here, I can't remember which, supposedly they're chanting cello, cello, cello to fill in for the fact that there was supposed to be a cello, but they couldn't afford it. And listening to these songs, I just wonder whether they, for some reason, were given better production, better attention on songs like My Generation and I Can See for Miles than they were able to afford or get on their other songs, or whether this really just shows that George Martin was the fifth Beatle and a good band alone is not enough. You need an elite producer. And I don't want to speak badly of whoever the Who's producers were. I don't know enough about this art form, but it certainly feels like at very least a George Martin level production visionary was missing. Regardless, I'm glad I filled myself in on musical history listening to these three records, and will certainly be listening to more of The Who going forward. I'm Zach Morgenstern. This is Ludwig von B. See you next time.